In order to convince you that group trauma treatment is important and effective for men, ordinary men, more than just veterans, I wanted to tell you a story about a man who sought group treatment to deal with symptoms of unprocessed trauma and got better as a result. But I don't have that story. Not because group treatment isn't effective, but because men aren't signing up for it or even acknowledging their struggles. Nowadays, everyone talks about male privilege and the advantages given to men in a lot of areas of our society. But when it comes to mental health, men are at a striking disadvantage to receive mental health services and even talk about their struggles. In men, substance use disorders are 3 times more common, and men account for at least 75% of people who complete suicide. But they're half as likely to seek mental health services. As a disclaimer, this talk generally refers to gender as a binary concept. I recognize that it isn't. However, research on transgender, genderqueer, and nonconforming individuals is in its infancy. There are important and distinct mental health needs for those populations, but that's not the focus of today's talk. Also, it might seem strange that I, a white woman, am talking to you today about treatment for men, so allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ilana Berman, and for the last 9 years, I've been doing trauma-related work in a variety of settings. I'm passionate about working with trauma survivors because I don't think it's fair that people have to suffer with everyday living just because something bad happened to them. And as a 4th-year student in a PhD program for clinical psychology, I know there are treatments out there so that they can help reclaim their lives. Okay, so what is trauma? And yes, that's trauma with a TR, not drama. In psychology, when we talk about trauma, it's not necessarily physical or blunt force trauma. It's an emotional wound. Historically, prime examples of trauma have included going to war, or having a car crash, or experiencing a rape. Those can definitely be traumatic, but there's more. Tides are beginning to turn in the understanding that trauma is subjective. And that means that we each experience situations differently. So you're the only one who knows if an incident was traumatic for you. Essentially, trauma is an emotional wound. And so it overwhelms us. It overwhelms our body's capacities, our resources. In the moment when our biological instincts to fight, to flight, or freeze kick in, and long after the event has passed. So statistically, men are more likely to be exposed to trauma, but they're less likely to receive help and seek it, really. In our recent community recruitment for trauma treatment groups at the psychological clinic on campus, we actually received 0 inquiries from men. Okay, so if men are saying they're not affected by trauma, they're fine, they're over it, we should just believe them and let them get on with their lives, right? Well, not so fast. In my experience, as supported by research, a lot of men have not only experienced but been affected by these traumatic events. And so, given these experiences, we'd like to help them, right? And so this doesn't turn into a traumatic event for me. I'm gonna reference my note cards. A lot of men are hesitant to identify these traumas as traumas. They just consider these events as part of life with bad luck. Nevertheless, natural disasters happen, people die, parents aren't as supportive as we'd hoped. And so you don't have to identify these events as a trauma in order to be traumatized. You might not even recognize the aftermath of trauma, even if you're experiencing it. But sometimes other people notice the signs. We've all seen the symptoms, whether we notice it in someone we love or maybe even ourselves, but maybe we haven't exactly had the label for it. So some of these symptoms come up pretty often, actually. We can see the symptoms as sometimes we notice a facial reaction, a wince, or a far-off look. Someone is experiencing a flashback, feeling like they're reliving that event. Sometimes these flashbacks come in the form of nightmares, making it difficult to fall asleep or staying asleep, making us tired from restless nights. Sometimes we see someone who's jumpy or always on edge. We all know someone who's too scared to sit with their back to the door at a restaurant. And sometimes in men, we might even view that as an honorable or protective act, when really it can be a sign of trauma. Sometimes this hypervigilance comes in the form of the fear of being abandoned. So maybe we cling a little too tight or don't get too close to anybody in the first place for fear that everyone will eventually hurt us or leave us anyway. And so there are ways that trauma can change the way that we look at the world, the way we look at ourselves and others. Sometimes these symptoms come when we're alone, without anyone there to witness. Maybe it's that nagging feeling that we could have saved our friend, or when we make a mistake at work, we hear our mother's voice telling us how useless we are. Trauma really can change everything. And so we've got to do something about that, right? Because in men, trauma can look a little differently. In general, men are more likely to react externally or act out, expressing their fears in the form of anger or irritability. In America, men are more likely to kill and are responsible for over 90% of all murders. These stresses can also express themselves in different ways. So we can project this stress onto our relationships, romantic or otherwise, have difficulty connecting or communicating with others, and really just impact the way that we function. So there's a lot going on here. The point is, men are exhibiting symptoms of trauma without realizing that they're symptoms of trauma. Symptoms are really hiding in plain sight. And so we know that everyone is affected. Everyone can be affected. Additionally, alcohol and drugs can be a common outcome of experiencing trauma. We sometimes turn to substances as a form of avoidance, a coping mechanism. So yes, avoidance. To make things worse, as humans, we have this tendency to avoid. We don't want to talk about things. We don't even want to think about them. And sometimes that can work great for us, for a little bit, right? But then we experience we want to avoid the anxiety, so we exit the situation when we're faced with a trigger, like authority figures or the scent of cologne that our abusive father wore, or maybe the white car, like the one from the accident. So that strategy works for a bit, but it fails us over time. It actually makes things worse for us. Those thoughts come into our mind more often, and it seems even more unmanageable. So furthermore, there's a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And of these 10 types of traumas, studies have shown that the more types of trauma experienced, the more severe the symptoms are. In fact, individuals who've experienced at least 4 of these types of traumas are way more likely to experience mental and physical problems like stroke, heart disease, and even die up to 20 years sooner. So we know that not addressing the underlying trauma that is fueling these symptoms can be a big problem. The good news is we have treatments and a lot of evidence that they work. One of these treatments is a group trauma treatment that uses exposure to the thoughts and the memories of the trauma by telling your story in a specific way. And cognitive processing, which is learning to understand, to be aware of how you formed these beliefs and challenge the unhelpful ones, like maybe no one can be trusted, ever, and learning some more helpful coping patterns and ways of thinking. So taking these things together, we're teaching people that not to avoid the trauma, but to actually approach it. Because yes, these things are absolutely uncomfortable to talk about, but they're not dangerous. And doing so, we can learn a way to get through those emotions that come up and lead more successful lives without these symptoms interfering. So going through these trauma treatment can certainly be done in an individual setting, especially because it's just you and the therapist that would know what's going on, right? But it can actually be even more useful to provide this in a group setting. The additional benefits like support and validation can come not just from a paid therapist, but also your peers. People often fear reactions that they get from others that they might have actually received before when talking about trauma. You've got shame, blame, social rejection, invalidation. All of that is terrible. Trauma can make us feel isolated and alone. And so when we come together in a group, it's different. So now imagine experiencing the exact opposite of everything you've feared. In this safe, confidential, and non-judgmental environment, participants have the opportunity to learn that they're not alone. Other people have gone through similar things. And so they can support each other because they're all in their own stage in a journey of recovery to getting better. They can provide that encouragement, that support, that compassion, and really work together learning new strategies of how to move forward. Okay, so it sounds pretty great, right? So why aren't men signing up for group treatment? Well, stigma. As former NFL player Joe Ehrman once said, "The 3 most destructive words that every boy that every man hears when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man. Societally and culturally, men are raised to think that emotions are signs of weakness and vulnerability. They're told to be strong and tough and pick themselves up by their bootstraps. And so that's really hard to do and kind of sets us up for failure. And they're also taught that other men don't have these emotional experiences. It's not like we see a lot of examples in mainstream media of men discussing their mental health problems. Most male characters I can think of that even discuss mental health are portrayed as gay or socially rejected. Even women are featured in the advertisements for depression commercials or seen in films reaching out for support. These stereotyped and gender portrayals only further instigate the reluctance of men to seek help. So expressing and experiencing these emotions is somehow seen as counter to the concept of masculinity. But emotions are important. They give us information, they communicate with others, and they help us process the world around us. So we kind of need those. As children, boys and girls begin equally emotional and expressive. But even well-intending adults start to interpret behavior through gendered lenses. Even as young as infants, adults will interpret behavior the same facial response as fear if they're told the infant is a girl and anger if they're told the infant is a boy. So by the age of 3 to 5 years old, boys are actually starting to show signs of hiding their emotions. 3 to 5 years old. So take this history, this culture, and combine that with this tendency to avoid, and now it makes sense why men aren't eager to sign up for group treatment, talk about their past experiences and current difficulties with the group of other men. I get it. It's tough. So let me illustrate this point for you with 2 examples of people I've met in real life in recruiting for trauma treatment groups in the community. So in the first session of a trauma treatment group at a local women's prison, I met a woman at the first session who said, well, I had this trauma. Well, she had actually heard the recruitment story several times before she even got to sit in that room. She said, I was hesitant to sign up and I still don't know if this group is right for me. And she said she experienced something bad when she was younger, but it was so long ago that, she doesn't think it affects her anymore. And she was quiet for the first few weeks as other people expressed their symptoms of having difficulty trusting people and sort of missing out on opportunities because they were too scared. They had this anxiety. But eventually she started to share too, and it was affecting her by these intrusive nightmares, and she was having promiscuous sex and discussed that she actually had started using drugs to numb out those feelings too. So these symptoms were really intruding in her life. She didn't want to give up recreation time to come and be there and talk about that. But she shared her story of child sexual abuse in that 4th session of group. By the end of the 8-week treatment, this woman had reported decreased symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And all of these gains were maintained at least 3 months after treatment when we followed up. So it was the supportiveness of the encouragement of the prison staff as well as the supportiveness of the clinicians that engaged her in treatment, but really it was the examples of the other women sharing their stories and encouraging her to stay. So in contrast, I met a man at a local drug court facility when recruiting in the community there. And he said he had a hard life, but he didn't experience trauma. I was never raped or anything, he said. And so he said, he basically was like, okay, so this happened to me when I was young, but, so what happened to him is he said his father used to hit him, his siblings, and especially his mom. And he said, well, that doesn't really bother me now. And you want me to go to treatment just because my dad hit me? Everybody I know has a story like this. Why would I do that? Besides, he was too busy for group with everything going on with drug court, and he had bills to pay. He was working all the time, and he said he was trying to pay child support for these kids he didn't even get to visit. And that was the moment where I saw the sadness in his eyes. So he says he's over it, but his drug court counselor tells us that he's actually missing appointments a lot of the time. He's getting angry in group settings, and he's sort of joking about everything that's happened to him and not taking it seriously, which is another form of avoidance. So these symptoms, these seemingly normal behaviors are actually symptoms of trauma, and they're interfering with his life at this point. But he said, no, thank you. And I respected that autonomy. So we told each other to have a good day, and that was the end of our interaction. See, I wanted to tell you a story that was successful, but I don't have that because this kept happening man after man. Sounds frustrating, huh? Actually, it's more disappointing to me in that, as you could see, these women were really benefiting from group. They loved the experience, they loved connecting with other women, and they really like being bothered by those symptoms a little bit less. But these men denied themselves that opportunity. They didn't want to participate, and so we didn't get a group going for males at that time. So, what are we supposed to do about that? One place where we look as an example is the Department of Veteran Affairs. The VA actually has men engaged in trauma treatment groups. How did they do that? It's so popular there, they sometimes even have a wait list. Well, it wasn't an overnight achievement for them either. It took about 20 years from the time that they decided to hire a clinical psychologist to develop and improve treatments to serve male populations, and then encourage men to sign up and increase recruitment. So what it took there was this huge culture shift within the organization, from the top down, from the management to staff, and permeating throughout the ranks of veterans, that not only was help available, but that they could utilize it to help recover from what they'd been through in their service. In order to utilize those services, men had to recognize two things. One, they were affected by their experiences, and two, treatment could help. They had to be encouraged to do that. So, similar to what happened at the VA, society at large could really benefit from a culture shift. This here is my top-down approach. I'm coming to you as a clinical psychologist in training, talking to you, engaged and interested people about what I've seen. Men struggling and not realizing that they don't have to, and that they can still keep their man card if they ask for help. So, what are we supposed to do? We've got to figure it out at this point. We've got to tackle the barriers. And I'm not saying I'm the first one to do this. Don't get me wrong. There have been attempts from within the field before to do that. For example, there's a website called mantherapy.org, and it utilizes the existing stereotypes of strong men with facial hair and uses colloquial language like when Wary grabs you by the balls, or it's okay to cry even if it's not about sports. That's a great start, right? But we need more. And it's going to take all of us to make that shift. We're working to create safe places, but they have to be utilized to be effective. We're changing the language that we use in recruitment. We're also trying to increase awareness in the public of everything that's gone on so that we know about the impact of trauma. So here I am today. And yet it's still going to take a community of people to support men and help them realize that some of the difficulties they're going through might be an expected result of what's happened to them. So let's do this together. Let's teach children and we've got to teach children and adults to be aware of their emotions, to recognize them, and to respond to them with compassion. We recognize that it's unfair and that you don't have to feel this way anymore. We're ready to reward the strength that it takes because it takes more strength to ask for help than it does to suffer alone. So when you're ready to step up, we're here for you. More help is on the way when you're ready to fight for it. Thank you.